Hello, in this video, we are going to talk about code smell. Let's get to it. Welcome to another awesome video. As you can see here, we finally got our setup and we're just playing around with some settings such as our nice screen right here and some lights here and there. And we'll constantly be changing it out. Also be finding a better camera for me to use for the videos, and I would love your input, so comment down below of what you think of the setup so far. So now let's actually go into the main topic of code smells. And it's actually a really common topic that people use when they're actually talking about coding. But what is code smells? Well, what we mean by code smells is that it doesn't really smell, right? That's not really possible because it's not a physical thing unless you're putting your nose against the screen, which isn't very likely. But essentially, it's something that looks a little bit off in your code and it doesn't really make sense or it doesn't really need to be there. And that's something that you can refactor or maybe even get rid of. Now, this is very different than errors and bugs because errors and bugs can cause problems inside your code. But when your code smells, it just means that something looks off. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work or it's causing issues. The term itself actually got started way long ago, but was actually popularized by Kent Beck on Words Wiki way back in the 1990s. And it was more used inside of the book called Refactoring Improving the Design in Existing Code by Martin Fowle. And now it's actually used a lot when we are referring to something that looks a little bit off in your code. And it's used a lot within agile programming and the agile methodology. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in a separate video. So the reason why we need to care if our code smells or not is that sometimes in some of our coding languages, performance does matter. If you don't have that most efficient code inside of your code base, then it could drag down performance. And because of that, we may need to eliminate some dead code, some unused code that we have in our program that we're not even using. And also, it takes up some memory for us to have. And especially with some programming languages that are very memory driven, having a lot of dead code or having a lot of something that smells that isn't really good for the program at all, because that will overload the memory, and memory is actually a lot precious in those programming languages. And we actually talked a little bit about this before in our wet and dry video. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and click right there. And with the wet and dry video, we need to keep our code as dry as possible. If we are repeating ourselves multiple times, then that means that our code does smell. And when we have the best code, it is really good and efficient, and also is really good for collaboration. Because if you have something that's off, or if something doesn't look right inside of your code base, then it might be a little bit harder to collaborate on your projects. So let's actually talk about a good rule of thumb to see if your code is smells or not. So the main thing that you should ask yourself is that, can it be written better? And does it look a little bit off? Because if any of these are answered yes, that means that your code does smell, and you might have to do something about it. Now let's go over some common reasons and examples of how your code can smell. The first example that we'll go over is overcomplicating a simple problem. And you are going to be having a complex solution instead of just a simple solution. And that's not really a good thing to have, because it really could drag down a lot of things and you're just overcomplicating it there. There are some reasons that if you are trying to learn something, then this might be okay to have it be more abstract, but in most cases you want your code as efficient as possible. Here is an example that we have on the screen. And here instead of doing an add, what this code shows here is that we actually wrote a whole entire function, and it pulls in the parameters of num1, num2, and then we are returning the sum of both of those. And for us to use add, we need to call on that function. And that's not really the best solution that we are able to do. Like, we don't even really need to have add in our particular case. We can just do 3 plus 5, right? It's being redundant in this case. And then the one to the right is actually doing the add already inside of the parameters as a parameter. So that's really just overdoing it and overusing the functionality. So just go ahead, for simple problems, you can use a simple solution. The next way your code can smell is that if you have too many common names inside of your project. And what I mean by this is that you have a certain name that you call multiple things. You might be confused of what it is that you're actually talking about. For example, if you have a file name called class, a folder name called class, a method name also called class, and a variable name called class, you can see how you can get very confused. If I am referring to a class, then I don't know if I'm referring to the folder, the method, or the variable name, right? So I need to be much more careful when I'm picking my common names inside of my projects. And class is also a reserved word in most languages, so that's not a good way that you can name your projects, and also other things that is inside of your projects. So if you are confused or if you don't know what's what or where things are, that might just mean that your code does smell. A better solution to the problem is having dynamic names. And with dynamic names, you can actually name it in a way where it is for you to understand. Because in the last problem, if you are using that inside of a live project, all of your collaborators or people you're working with, they are confused of what it means when you're saying class. But here, if you are dynamically naming your items, such as a file name called class index that shows all the classes, a folder name of all the class components, method name of course info, and a variable name of the fall cohort. So those are all of the items that we can have much more dynamic naming for. And it's a lot more better for us to do it this way, and it's easier for us to collaborate with others. So now I know where to put all of my class components, and I know what variable is I'm using. Now, the other common way that your code can smell is that if you have a long method or classes. As you remember, a method is supposed to only do one thing, one specific task, while a class should represent one single object. If we have, for example, what we have here, a person's class, and that person has a bunch of information about the address, about hobbies and education, that might actually be better as his own class instead of having it all under the person's class. And then you can use encapsulation and inheritance to inherit from person. That way you can do a connection with those associations. And that is a better way for you to approach this problem. So if you do have long methods and classes, you should think about refactoring them to more methods and classes. For this one of how your code can smell, this is kind of pretty obvious, but a lot of people do it anyways, just because they think that it is a normal thing for you to do. And that is doing excessive data, meaning that you're returning too much info than intended, or you're using too much info than intended, right? That can really drag down some performance, and also it's very unnecessary for most of these cases with excessive data. For example, if you go into a bank and you check your account balance, all you need is your email and probably your credit card. But then if they in return give you a balance and an email, first name, last name, address, street, zip, etc., 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 that's just excessive data, right? Like, you don't want all that data. You just want the account balance. And everything else is just too much information. And that goes the same with real life. If I am talking way too much and excessively, then most likely other people will start to peace out and would tell me too much information, right? So trust your instincts. It should be very much well intended that you shouldn't have excessive data, you should only have what you're asking for. So a good solution for this one is just return the balance. And if they ask for more info, then you can give them more info. You don't have to give them all the info at once. Now, there are other ways that you can have your code smells, such as data clumping, which is having similar data pass through the program and use over and over again. That's being wet code instead of dry code. Or you have lazy code, which is just small features that shouldn't be part of its own method or class. It could be part of another method or class. Shotgun surgery. Now, this is something that if you are making a single change, instead of changing it in one place, you have to change it in multiple places. So then that would be very inefficient for you to refactor, because then you have to refactor a bunch of other places. And there's a lot more things that I haven't mentioned yet, and other things that you'll probably see inside of your coding as well. But the main thing is that for you to recognize and for you to take a look at your code and see if your code smells, it just takes practice, right? I can list out so many other examples and so many other ways your code smells, but ideally, if you want to learn what they are and more importantly, how to fix it, then the good thing is to practice it. Again, just remember the good rule of thumb. If you have to ask yourself, can this be written better? And does this look off? If either of those is yes, that means that your code smells. That is all for this video. If you like it, please subscribe and comment, share below, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya.